One of the most fundamental roles that an administrator has to do is manage user accounts. Now, depending on how you've structured your organization, if you're a very small company, you may be working with a workgroup computer or a computer that is not a member of a domain. Also, you may have user accounts that are members of a domain. So what's the difference between them? Let's go to the whiteboard and see. So as we can see, there are two types of user account. On the left-hand side, you can see that we have local user accounts. And you can see that these reside in something called the SAM database. The SAM database, or Security Accounts Manager, is essentially a local database which allows users to access only local resources, such as, for example, shared folders, files, printers, and so on. This is created with the computer management console on the local machine. Now, you can obviously manage local resources using this tool on either a Windows Server 2003 server, Windows Server 2008 server that are not members of the domain. And you can also manage local user accounts, for example, on workstations as well, such as Windows Vista and also Windows XP Professional. On the other hand, we have domain user accounts here. And the nice thing about domain user accounts is that these are enterprise-wide. Now, that means that you can access all resources irrelevant of where you're actually located. These can be centrally managed and also placed in organizational units. And as you can see, one of the benefits of this is that you can control large numbers of users or even delegate permissions. In this case, the user accounts in a domain are created with a number of tools. The primary tool, of course, is Active Directory Users and Computers. You can also use some command line tools as well. So as we've seen, there are advantages to be in a work group and there are advantages to be in a domain. The only problem with a work group is it's fine if you've got maybe 3 or 4 or maybe even up to 10 users. In a small office location, it can be extremely flexible and very cost effective, as you don't need to deploy the overheads that Active Directory brings. Unfortunately, once the company grows beyond that number, so for example 20, 30, 40 or even 1,000 users, you can appreciate that it would be very difficult for an administrator to be able to manage all of those users individually. Also, in a workgroup scenario, if I was a user and I wanted access to your machine, then you would need to create an account for me, whereas I would also need to create an account for you. So there's lots of duplication. Whereas in Active Directory, you simply create the account once and it's centrally stored in the Active Directory database. So as you can see, both user account name either can be in the local computer or it can be as part of a domain. Now, it's important that when you design your naming context, that you understand what the naming rules are. So, for example, depending on the size of your organization, I wouldn't create a user account called Andy. I may decide to go ahead and, let's say, create an account called Malone and use the first initial instead. You may ask why. Well, obviously, if you've got a small amount of users, you can give the user logon name Andy, Bob, Jean, no problem. But as the company grows, you can pretty much see that that just wouldn't work. So a good idea is to, when you're designing a naming context, to think about, okay, either maybe by job function, or most companies use some type of surname followed by an initial. Again, whatever works for you. Now, when we talk about the different types of names, of course, you need to understand how these names are stored in Active Directory and also if they need to be unique or not. Let's go to the whiteboard and I'll show you what I mean. So I've called this my naming context, and you can see here that there are a number of different types of naming contexts. So for example, my user logon name, I just call this guy Andy. And again, remember that this must be unique. So you must have a user account which is unique in the domain. So every user account name must be unique. So again, I mentioned you may not want to use this type of name. In fact, you may want to use something like, let's say, Malone A. This is a really good example of a sensible name. And again, remember that that account name must be unique in the domain. The second type of name that we have is really dependent if you've got any older networks or any older clients, or if you've got kind of access to Windows 2000 servers. Of course, one of the things about Windows Server 2008, of course, is you really need to update those servers. But if you do, then the naming context the way it used to be was domain/username. And in fact, this is still used even today. If you want to log on to a domain followed by a particular user, you can do that in Windows Server 2008. And this is kind of a nice friendly way, because if you're using different domains or multiple domains, but again, this must be unique. Then we have something called a UPN, or user principal name, and you might recognize this as an email style address. Some may call it an SMTP style address, so andy@mycompany.com, for example. Of course, we also have an LDAP name, or LDN, or LDAP distinguished name. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a container or conical name, Andy. Andy's in an OU called sales, comma, he's on a domain controller called NW Traders in MSFT. So the LDAP distinguished name would be CN equals Andy, comma, OU equals sales, comma, DC equals NW Traders, comma, DC equals MSFT. Finally, we also have something called a relative distinguished name. And again, this must be unique in the forest. So, of course, when you start going into things like user principal names and also LDAP distinguished names, these are forest-wide. The last one, of course, is called the RDN, or the relative distinguished name. So you can see here, I've got a user or a container called Andy. And this is really, you need to make sure that this is unique within the OU. So if you've got multiple OUs, that's fine. You can have users called Andy. But again, if you're in a domain, you may want to make these unique. So that's the different types of naming context. User accounts in Windows Server 2008 can be configured in one of two locations. If you're in a work group, it can be configured through the Computer Management Console. And if you're in a domain, it can be configured in Active Directory Users and Computers, of course, which is an element, if you will, of Server Manager. Of course, you can also use command line tools, as well as tools like PowerShell. So there you have it, creating and managing user accounts in Active Directory.